everybody. This is Simon Majumdar, and welcome to a brand new episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast about things you didn't know about food. And I have to tell you, today's episode really is a very special episode, because not only am I going to introduce you to one of the most renowned chefs in the United States, someone who you will know if you watch television, if you watch Top Chef Masters, if you watch Chopped, where I think he is the most erudite judge on that show, and someone who has created a very important show, more recently, No Passport Required, someone who has created some of the most important restaurants in the United States, including where I first met him, even though he won't remember this, at Aquavit many moons ago, and Red Rooster in Harlem and in a number of other places. Someone who champions the Black culinary world, not just here in the United States, but around the world, more than just about anybody I know. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce onto Eat My Globe the one and only Marcus Samuelsson. Hi, Marcus.
Hi, Simon. So happy to be on your show. I know that we're going to talk lots about delicious food and our journey, so I'm excited about it.
Well, I'd love to do that, and I know we're going to go on and talk about something very specific, history-related. This is a food history podcast. But let's talk your own personal history first, because I think you have one of the most remarkable journeys from where you started to whom you've become. And it's happened not just because of you, but because of the help you've received. And I think that's something you're always keen to share. And I want our listeners to find out more about you before we move on.
Yeah. No, I might be the only Ethiopian you know. You never know. You might know a couple of more people. There's plenty of us out there. But I was born in a hut in a place called Abragodana, outside, about a 2-hour drive outside Addis Ababa, the capital in Ethiopia. And my sister, my mother, and I, the three of us had tuberculosis. Our mother walked us into the capital, eventually got us into Swedish hospital, and she passed away. But here's really where the story, really, I think this is like sort of a counterpoint in my life. I'm here because of the goodness of others. Many random acts happens after this that shows you that when someone says, I'm here because of my own success, no one has built anything by themselves. And me and my sister were 2.5 and 5, and a nurse at the hospital with single mother, nurse, 3 kids of her own, took us in.
Wow. And
she said, I cannot put these 2 kids out on the street. I'm better off taking them into my house and eventually setting them up for adoption. So she did that. It took about 4 months for her so we stayed with her. And eventually she found a Swedish adoption agency. And I went from being Kasahunsa guy to Marcus Samuelsson in a plane ride.
Wow. And from there, your culinary training took you off on a whole different journey, because you trained in Europe, didn't you, initially? Yeah. And then before you moved to the United States. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah. I mean, my grandmother, I would say I also wouldn't be here without my Swedish grandmother, right? Because she had a regular kitchen, but she had that pantry basement that so many Scandinavians have, where it's stored with jars of lingonberries and blueberries and mushrooms and all of these different things. And there was always a season for something, whether that was plum jam being made or apple or mushroom being pickled. So we were always working with her in her kitchen around food. And summertime, I grew up on a fishing island with my family and my uncles. So I literally grew up around food. The craftsmanship around cooking was always around us. And when I started cooking school in Gothenburg in Sweden, on the west coast of Sweden, I realized quickly that I've been cooking for a long time, and I knew very often more than the other kids, not because I worked so much in restaurant, because of really my training with my grandmother. I got a scholarship and went to Japan when I was 17 years old, 17, 18. And when I came back from Japan, I knew I wanted to be a chef, because I just those 3 months, I started to taste food that it was just so odd to me. I started to realize what umami was for the first time.
Uh-huh.
I ate raw fish. I ate blowfish, stuff like that no other Swedish 18-year-old kid had been around at that point. And continued, and I got a scholarship to go to Switzerland to work in Victoria Jungfrau. I worked there for 2 years, and eventually to go to France through a 3-star Michelin restaurant called Georges Blanc. And it was transformative experiences in my life.
And for me, when I've looked at your career, and as I said, I've been eating your food now for many years because by coming over to New York, I've always seen your culinary progression as being a search for identity. I think of all the chefs I know, you really root how you cook in who you are and finding out who you are. And obviously, because you come from so many different places. And tell me about that before we move into your book, because I think the book that we're going to talk about here and use as the basis for this episode, I think really is your kind of ultimate expression of your identity. Not that you've reached it yet, but it's a really great kind of joyous expression of who you are. So you moved over to the United States and cooked at Aquavit, which was just a remarkable restaurant and one that certainly I loved visiting. But tell us about your time coming to the United States and then following that and your introduction and your kind of passion for supporting the Black communities.
Well, I mean, choices and how they randomly happen to us in life, right? I was told after I thought I was done in France, I told my chef that, thank you so much, but it's time for me to go and find my own way. And he says, why? Where? What do you want to do? I said, I want to own a restaurant at some point, just as nice establishings as yours. And he said to me, that's not possible.
Wow.
And I said, what do you mean it's not possible? Well, do you know any Black-owned restaurant that has 3-star Michelin? I said, no. Do you know anyone in France or in Europe? And I said, no. And he said, that's your answer. You can work in a restaurant, but you cannot own one. And that was kind of the wake-up call for me. And I mind you, I didn't feel that he was a racist. He said it because that was the world that he knew.
He was talking about his reality.
He was talking about, and also the reality of what it looked like in the mid-90s,
yep.
Right? But I realized that was, I could not lower my ambition, and I just had to go and find another place, right? And I took a train ride home from Lyon to Gothenburg. It was a 40-hour train ride, lots of time to think about your next step. And when I got home, my father said, do you know anyone in New York? And I said, I do. You should go to New York. They had recently a Black mayor in New York City. Yep. And if they can support a Black mayor, they will also support a Black chef at some point. And that's really when I went to New York. At that point, I had a good resume. I got a job at Aquavit and eventually became the chef, 23 years old, way too young. But it changed once again, the projection of my life. We got 3 stars. And the world in New York City and America opened up for me. And I'll tell you, identity and, at that point, Swedish food is a minority cuisine. Mm-hmm. The new Nordic thing hasn't really taken off. This is pre that.
Absolutely.
But Swedes in America, they don't see themselves as minorities. And I always said, how can we express this cuisine? Because it's so good, but I want more people to understand it. And it's, internet is obviously happening at that time, but the link between internet and food really starts happening around 2002, 2003, 2004, etc. And this is the late 90s now. And I started to build my own building blocks that wasn't necessarily around Swedish ingredients, it was more around Swedish, what I looked at, New Nordic, and it was pickling, preserving. We had based it around our incredible game and seafood, and thinking about aesthetic. We have this minimalistic approach on how we cook, and textures that are very unique because how we pickle. So for me, it wasn't whether it would be herring or tuna. That was almost secondary to me. It was the cooking techniques that we applied to it. And I really loved cooking at Aquavit, but when you think about it, Ethiopian cuisine It's a cuisine of 120 million people. So the minority cuisine was not Ethiopia. The minority cuisine was actually Sweden.
Uh-huh.
The thing for me was I didn't know enough about my Ethiopian roots, and I didn't know enough about my African heritage in terms of food. And I really had to go on that journey myself. No one else could do that but me, and I had to do that. And that's really where I started to develop my next sort of chapter.
And for me, that's again where, we'd encountered each other on television, doing Next Iron Chef. And obviously I'd followed your food. And I still remember the very first time I went to Aquavit was actually, I think it was with a friend who worked for Drew Nearpoint, and she called Kathy Loop. And she was like, this restaurant, you have to go. And we went, and I think I even bought the book. I was so impressed with my meal and bought the book at Aquavit. I've still got it in London. And let's go on from there to talk about books, because I think you've published books. And again, I've seen a development in the books that you've published. You've obviously published a few. And the reason that I wanted you to come on this show now is that very kindly, when we were filming a show quite recently, you came to my trailer when we were together and you gave me a copy of this book. And it's called The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. And, I'm very lucky. We're in this business. A lot of people send me their cookbooks, either because they want me to show them on my social media, or, they're just being kind and they want me to have the books. And yes, they're often very lovely and they're well put together. And yet this is the first book in years that I literally sat down in my trailer to begin. And then when I got home and I read cover to cover, not just because of the recipes, not just because of that you were kind enough to give it to me, because this was to me one of the most important books in the culinary world that I'd seen for years. And it's, as I said, The Rise. And because it's a book that truly does what you do, champions not just the history or the current status, but the future of Black cooks in the world. And so I really wanted to talk about this book today and to pick out some people from it, which is why I asked you on. So perhaps you could tell us about the motivation for writing this book, because this feels like it's been kind of wrenched out of your soul when I read this.
Sure. Well, Simon, I think there's another reason that you forgot, that why people give you the book. You're also extremely knowledgeable about food, right? So when people give you, it's a bar, and people want to give you a book also because your knowledge, that knowledge is worth so much. I know we live in a time of social media and so, but knowledge, it's still king. You know what I mean? So we want to give you the book because of,
thank you,
because of that reason too. So, but Simon, I feel like, for me, it's a conversation between anonymous labor and visible labor. And as people of color, we have constantly done the work without the recognition.
Yes.
I think when you are a chef that have a platform, you're a person that a platform, it's your job and duty to champion. And that's what you do with your voice here. And that's what you do in other places too. You bring forward narratives that we all know are great, but a lot of people in the public doesn't know about it. Not because they don't want to, it's just because they might not have access to it or no one presented it. So for me as a chef, it's very important as a Black chef to present and broadcast. And, you cannot talk about American cuisine without talking about the continent and Africa and the linear between West Africa specifically and the Carolinas and the South. And I think most people understand that when it comes to music. The link between blues from Mali and West Africa. Uh-huh. We understand jazz as an art from Africa, but truly an American art form through Black excellence, hip hop, even rock and roll, bebop, gospel. But when it comes to food, it's vague. And I felt like, let's unpack this. And there are 5 original cuisines that are all part of the American experience, but also linked to the African American experience. Barbecue, Creole, Cajun, Southern, what we really very often discuss as soul food, and Creole as well. But you have Creole, you have Southern, you have barbecue, you have Cajun, and these cuisines are all part of the Black experience without sometimes you think about it and sometimes you might not think about it, right? It could be ingredient driven. It could be that the history hasn't written in the Black experience into the ownership of that, right? And if the history is not written, then how are you going to be able to have memories that are correct? And for me, it was so much about giving the authorship of Black craftspeople, chefs, writers. If you give the authorship to people who are due, then the memories that the audience will have will be correct. And therefore, then the desire of want to have these experiences will then go up, the worth, right? And there's numerous experiences of where these are all misplaced. And that's why we don't know enough of this. And this is really the job of the book.
And how do you set out? I mean, that's a huge, broad scope you had to look at. I mean, that's a big task because it's something that people have been working on, for many years, and you had a platform to approach it. How do you even begin? I mean, I don't think, even as a writer, I would go, okay, I'm just going to sit in a room and scream for a while because I don't even know how to approach that.
Yeah. Well, the great thing is, first of all, it took 4 years, and shout out to Little Brown. Every year when we were delayed, Mike said, hey, take your time. And Usai, that was my co-author, Usai came from her background is Nigerian, and it helped so much, right? Her understanding, obviously, about American culture, but also Nigerian culture, West African culture. So we could really go back and forth on this. And I started out with really breaking down my own experience and the people in my orbit, and then looking outside. So people from the continent, who was doing the most interesting work, people from the Caribbean, where is the work who has derivative from the Caribbean, and then obviously looking at the food that we know from the migration, but also that Blackness is not monolithic. And that's why sometimes you have to label stuff to show that there are a plural of things. And, I was looking at incredible people like Greg Godet, that is obviously Haitian background via New York, but working in Portland. Looking at someone that is not as known, but as a craft person, incredible. Eric Castell, been the chef de cuisine at Le Verdun for 25 years.
Extraordinary chef. Extraordinary chef.
You can argue one of the most talented chefs in the world. And so just showing that sometimes they exist in restaurants, sometimes they exist in a institutional kitchen, maybe in a school. Sometimes it exists in a pop-up. And our food and our culture is not always in restaurants because we've never had the same access to institutional money. That doesn't mean our food didn't matter. So when you think about tradition, think about, Mr. Scott Rodney, right? He's been arguably one of the best barbecue chefs in the world, not in the country, in the world. So his tradition is oral. The way he now came out with his cookbook, but the way he was taught by his father was oral. So how do you capture this beautiful oral culture, right, into a recipe form? So it was really looking at these incredible people and chefs and colleagues and friends, and then learning that Blackness can go in many different directions. Naisha Arrington, that is both Korean and African American. Right? And living in California. Now you're talking, that is exciting for me as a chef, right? So there's all these different versions. Nashama Bailey, moving from New York to Savannah, just all these incredible stories. So I wanted to broadcast, I wanted to highlight, and I wanted to do books. I'll tell you one thing about this, Simon. When I was coming up in the early 90s, I was so starved of books that were not French. So one of the first books that I bought that I loved, because he wasn't French and he was just represented other to me, was White Heat by Marc-Pierre White.
Of course, yes.
Because I didn't even know you could have long hair, you could be that young, you could smoke. I'm buying that book. And then eventually I bought the Charlie Trotter cookbooks because I've never seen food photography in that way. And eventually 5 years later, Charlie Trotter starts mentoring me. But I'm telling you that the rise is really, for me, has two audiences. One is for chefs that look like me, that knows there is a pluralism of our industry is filled with incredible talent. And wherever you live, whether you're in America or in Europe, you can go and seek out these incredible people, and they're here in the industry. And then for people who don't look like me, and say, hey, support Black chefs. There are in every neighborhood. And not only did we focus on 45 Black chefs in the book, we also listed another 200 Black chefs. So no one can say, well, I don't know how to find them.
You did give that shout out at the end. I will say this, and you know me, Marcus, I have no filters. If I didn't think this, I wouldn't say it. White Heat is one of the most important books, I think, in culinary history, in the way that it changed everything. And I used to eat at Marco's restaurant, Harvey's, so I know it. I think Nose to Tail by Fergus Henderson is another one of those that every chef or every food person should have. Charlie Trotter's is. And I will say this to you now, that I was saying it to my colleagues here in the studio, this book that you've written, The Rise, should be up on the shelf with those books, and it will be. I think this is a book that has a lot of legacy. The two words I used about this when I was describing it: one, it's celebratory. There's no apology for this. This is not, oh, we're this and this. This is who we are, and this is how we've stamped ourselves upon the world, whether you know it or not. And the second I think about this is it's absolutely and I'd like to ask you about this. The way that you set out the book is so unusual. So traditionally, if you're writing a book that has some history, or it has you would start with the history, and then you'd come forward to the present day, and then you start with looking off into the future. Yeah. I'd just love to know just about that structure before we go in to talk about some of the amazing people you want to share with us from the book.
I wanted to start, it's funny, right? Because I really wanted to start with some positive. I really had that emotion in my head. It's like you're waiting on in Europe, it maybe would be a soccer field, or in America it would be a basketball court, where these young teenagers are waiting for, we got next. Get off the court, we got next. And that there is a whole generation of incredible young Black chefs that they did not grow up maybe on Julia Childs. They grew up on Food Network or on YouTube or on TikTok or whatever, and they just want in the game. And there's some incredible young talent that are here. And I wanted to present that there is this book, like you said, is not apologetic. It's also very positive. There's a generation coming in, and there's many more people that are not in the book that could have been there. So that was important for me. Then at the same time, it's not an either or. And one of the biggest issues in Black culture is that we get this very slim narrative, and maybe you hear about it through music and that's it. This is an opportunity to show that you can honor Edna Lewis and Leah Chase and Patricia Gonzalez, that was 17 years old when we started the book. You can do both, you know?
I think you really did that. So what we always try and do when we have folks come on and we share time with them, not a challenge so much because we're not that kind of show, but ask you to give us kind of 4 or 5 people that you've chosen 5 here, that we can put up into what I call the Eat My Globe Culinary Pantheon. We had Alton Brown on earlier, and he was giving us some of his folks from history, which was really fun. And you sent me a really remarkable list. So with your permission, I'd love just to go through those. And what we're not doing is negating any of the other people in this book, because you could have given me 100. Like you said, you listed another 200 chefs at the end of the book. And I have to say, I was reading through them going, well, I don't know this person. I need to go and find out. So it's a book that I think sets a challenge as well to everyone who's interested in this community. But if you don't mind, just sharing about the people who've obviously touched you enough that when I asked you for a list, you said, oh, I must include. So would you mind sharing some of those with us from the book?
Sure, of course. So I think someone like Nisha Arrington, that a lot of chefs knows, and some chefs have cooked with her, but she is a very, very, very special young chef. She is African-American and Korean-American, works out of Los Angeles, but really came up through Josiah and Melis in Los Angeles, to have this beautiful craft of French culinary training, but also is diving into her Asian American, African American background. One chef that is an amazing talent is Tristan Eaps, which is our chef at Red Rooster in Overtown. Tristan is Trinidadian. His mother's Trinidadian, but he grew up in Houston, grew up in the Carolinas. And he's watching Tristan he's really becoming this incredible chef. And I've worked with Tristan for 7 years and watching his evolution.
What do you think it is about chefs like Tristan? And I went to read about him, and I know he had his own restaurant in Houston for a while and was somewhere that was getting remarkable reviews. What do you think it is about them that makes them connect in a way? Is it a personal curiosity, like an intellectual? Something you have is intellectual curiosity. You're always reading, you're always asking. What is it about Tristan that you think kind of rings out?
What I feel with both Tristan and Aisha, for example, they are young, but they're old souls. They're really in love with their craft. They're not fast people, right? They're really in love with their craft. Like Tristan can text me and said, I tried this technique that he read about in a book from the 60s. And, we're going to do that at our next event. And we're doing it, right? and it could be things like we're going to butter poach something, but maybe we butter poach it in an Indian ghee or an Ethiopian kebe or something like that, but he wants to do that technique because he's just read about it, right? He's not fast, but he's really studying. And Aisha, the same thing, right? So there's that curiosity of reading old recipes, matching it with ingredients that are modern, and obviously searching for flavors, but also searching their own identity.
Wonderful. So tell me who else you gave me such a great list, and I had such a fun time working through it. Who else would you like to share with us?
Well, I mean, there's many people, but one of the chefs that I love the most is Greg Godet from Portland. Greg is opening his Haitian American restaurant this year, and his vocabulary in cooking is completely fluent. He's just incredible. He's like one of those musicians that can play every instrument, and he does that in the kitchen. And, he was trained here in New York with Chef Jean-Georges, and had his restaurant departure in Portland for years, and then took a year off just to focus on his opening of his restaurant this year, and also taken a lot of time to lend his voice to Independent Restaurant Coalition during this year. And that's the other thing that I can tell with all these chefs. They're also find time to lend their voices to other things that are part of their community.
Right? They're building up. One of the chefs that you did share with me is someone from a tradition from a country that I visited and enjoyed the food a great deal, from Nigeria, Chef Michael Bede. I mean, tell me a little bit about his cuisine and Nigerian cuisine, because a lot of people might not know that, but as a cuisine, I think it has a lot of influence.
Michael is, talk about who got next. Michael is amazing. And Michael did his training here at 11 Madison. He worked together with Kwame at the same time. And what's happening now, and it would have happened even more if it would have been for the pandemic, but what's happening is that a lot of chefs are now going back to the continent to train, the way we went back to France or the way we went to Japan. And Michael very often I get so many calls from my chef friends saying, connect me with Michael. And that's how we work as chefs, right? We have one connection in Lagos, in a city of 20 million people. And Michael is now that guy that we all connect with. And then Michael sets up this 4-day trip for the chefs. And they come back completely transformed. And, Michael is just a beautiful soul because he shares. He has an incredible kitchen studio in Lagos. And if you want to know some of the most exciting food in the world right now, it's happening in Michael's kitchen in Lagos.
I need to go. I have to say, I've been to Lagos and I've been to Abuja, and, a lot of traditional food. But what I saw was, and this is sometimes I think people forget, they think of, I get it with India a lot because obviously my family's from India. People think that it's this kind of ossified food that's just sitting there in history, and they don't realize that there are young chefs there who are just as creative and just as exciting as everything that's going on in the United States. And there was food that I was seeing when I was in Lagos, which was many years ago, that was completely blew my mind because I'd never seen these techniques before.
And Michael is that guy. And sometimes you know this. It starts with somebody that changed the trajectory. I mean, think about Fela Kuti when he changed the trajectory of music, and now 30 years later you have Afrobeats, right?
Yep.
But we didn't have that. It wouldn't be someone like Fela. I said, hey, I've been to America, and here's my African sound, and how can I go back and forth? And that's what Michael is doing. His techniques are a blend between sort of Western, but also with steeped in with Nigerian and West African techniques. So this tennis match becomes sort of global, which is beautiful. And obviously now with technology, I get so excited following Michael's Instagram, see what he's up to.
Now, I would like to ask you about a couple of other chefs. There's one I had to ask you about because on No Passport Required, and I remember watching this when you said it, you said this person was the most subversive chef in the country. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Is it Johnny Rose?
Yes, it is. So I wanted to ask you why you thought this person was.
Well, what I love about Johnny is that, you know this, Simon. We were told as chefs, leave your town, go to another city. Whatever your city is doing, it's not of great food. You have to leave. Johnny said, I'm going to go to New York, but I'm going to come back to my town. Not only am I going to come back to my town, I'm going to come back to my part of the town, right? And he built his urban garden on that corner. And what people would say a rough neighborhood, but for him, it's his neighborhood. And also the way he thinks about food, he might not serve his sweet potato until 6 months later. He air dried them for 6 months. So he's really going back. And if you walk into his kitchen, there's tons of tins and jars that you're not allowed to touch because it's all about pickling and preserving and linking us back to flavors and food that really goes back to maybe 200-300 years. And that's, for me, is so beautiful, the way he thinks about flavor, the way he links it back to his narrative and his journey. And he really expressed himself as truly original. And that's what I love about that. And Houston have always had appreciation. First of all, Houston is the most diverse city in America. It's one of the sort of like under the radar cities that are amazing in food.
Yes.
And Johnny is one of the people that contributes to that.
And you said pairs, just to quote, I think someone said in a review, each dish is paired. It's like an educational moment in African American history. So for me, when you eat, it should be giving, not just, as you said, nourishment. It should be giving you intellectual curiosity. Before we move on just to some of the fun questions, and I'm conscious of your time, let's talk about some of the people who've passed, because one of the things that when certain people pass in this community, you're one of the first to come out and give them the respect, people like Leah Chase. Can we mention some of those people who you've encountered who maybe aren't with us anymore, but whose roots are so solid that they're going to be with us in a form forever?
Well, I could tell you that Leah Chase is probably the person that has informed me and inspired me and pushed me the most in this country.
Could you tell people, sorry to interrupt, could you perhaps tell people about Leah Chase because they may not know her?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dookie Chase is this restaurant in New Orleans that has only been around since 1940s. You think about that. It's 80 years of excellence. And Dookie is the name of Leah's late husband, but they ran the restaurant for 75 plus years. And now her daughter, Stella, and the family is running it. And think about it. This is pre-integration, segregation. And Leah broke the laws for the first 20 years because she served white and black people in the restaurant. She served everybody. She had numerous chances to move elsewhere in other parts of town, but she stayed in her neighborhood. And she is, for me, one of the most transformative chefs of this country. And when you wanted to do the big deal in New Orleans, whether that was a wedding or closing of a business or signature of something or you wanted to see the local celebrity, you went to Dookie Chase. You put your best on, you went to Dookie Chase, and you saw Nat King Cole, you saw Muhammad Ali, etc. And Leah is that person. And she's also the only person when you walk into the restaurant, there's this picture of her and President Obama, and she holds him in a headlock because he's about to put hot sauce on her gumbo. And she's like, no, 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 no. Don't put hot sauce in my gumbo without tasting it.
we were lucky enough to go to Dookie Chase, and I have to say, I'm going to put my hand up, and I did say this to someone last night. I do think New Orleans is the greatest eating city in the United States, and she was very much the queen of New Orleans. So I think she's a great person to mention. Marcus, this has been so much fun. But before we let you go, I have fun questions. Are you up for some fun questions?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Hi, everybody. This is Simon Majumdar, the creator and host of the Eat My Globe Food History podcast. Now, those of you who have been listening to the podcast since we began over 2 years ago, nearly 50 episodes so far, will know that we have never sought out sponsorship for the podcast. It's very much been a labour of love. However, along the way, a large number of people have approached us suggesting they would like to support the podcast. And so, we have opened up a page on patreon.com to allow those of you who listen regularly to do just that. Any support we will get will allow us to purchase research materials, buy ingredients for recipes, and maybe, when we can get out and about, to bring you some very special in-the-field reporting. But, and this is really important, this is not just a one-way street. For varying levels of membership of our Patreon club, there will be access to fantastic Eat My Globe swag, including that incredible chopping board so many of you have written to me about, recipes based on historical periods about which we chat each week, video shout-outs, signed pictures, and even along the way some very special episodes just for members. So, if you've enjoyed the episodes of Eat My Globe you've listened to so far and would like us to make many more into the future, do head over to www.patreon.com/eatmyglobe and consider taking out a membership. Any support will be much appreciated. Remember, that's www.patreon.com/eatmyglobe. So thank you very much. Keep listening. Before we go on to those as well, and I will say it again, if anyone is listening to as part of the Eat My Globe family, you must have this book. It's called The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. And I honestly believe it is up there with White Heat. It is up there with Nose to Tail Eating. It is up there with Charlie Trotter. And I think this book is going to be part of the legacy of the American culinary world. And I want to thank Marcus for giving it to me. And it's something that I'm going to treasure. So thank you. So, okay, let's have some fun questions. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting one because you've been on such a journey. If you were a meal, what would it be?
I think I would be, I would start off with herring on an injera bread with some coffee roasted mustard sauce and some horseradish, a little bit horseradish and bearberry, a little bit heat on top.
Wow, that's great. And then you've taken us over a whole different... I know when I watch you cook, and when we did a guy's grocery games, and I'm watching you cook, it's just your mind goes in so many different directions. I don't know how you manage it, but that would be a great... I want to try that, apart from the coffee, of course, because I'm allergic to coffee, and it will kill me. So I can't eat coffee. But apart from that, that sounds like a great meal. Okay, now this is a really interesting one for you because of your study of history. If you could go and have any single meal or a meal in any period of history, at any time in history to have a meal, when would it be?
I tell you what, there's two meals that were game-changing to me. And one was when I saved up my money from Switzerland. I took the train to Monte Carlo to eat. I read a note that Alain Ducasse was serving a vegetarian tasting meal.
Uh-huh.
I didn't conceptualize, what do you mean? Are you allowed? Can you? What does it look? I had so many questions. I was 21 years old. I was like, how is this possible? And the only way to find out was to borrow a vest from one of the waiters and from somebody else and jump on the train. And I got to this place in Monte Carlo and I ate the tasting menu there. And it was vegetarian and it changed my life. And 6 years later at Aquavit, we served vegetarian tasting menus. But this was one of these things that I didn't even conceptually understand that it was possible. And it was so, of course, I couldn't afford the wine. Of course, I was like by far the poorest person in the room, but it changed my life. And I was like, wow, I was blown away. You know, the other meal, and I know it's not as big maybe, but was for me. It was when I had the chance to eat with Charlie Trotter in Chicago in the kitchen. And this is maybe like 98, 99. And it was just the first time that I saw that Americans can do it too. This was no longer something I've seen in Japan. This was not something I've seen in France and experienced in France by working in France. Americans can do this as well. And today we obviously take that for granted because America's been doing it for a long time. But at that point, it wasn't something you could think about to take for granted. And I saw the most beautiful 15-course tasting menu in the kitchen. So those two meals for me changed my life. And I was like, I'm on the right path. And I didn't feel like I was part of it yet, but I felt like, wow, these are people that are in my orbit, although I'm way outside of this orbit. But I was in the movie, even if I was an extra that was dead in the first second of the movie, I was still in the movie.
Those meals, I think, that change your life are so vital for me in the United States. And I have a similar reaction. I'd been in Britain and I'd been in France, and I'd never really experienced that in the United States until the first time I sat at a table at Les Spinasse when Grey Kunz was cooking. And I went, and for the first time, and interestingly, someone who we know, Rocco, was cooking in the kitchen then, and also who we lost recently, Floyd who passed away. He was there as well in the kitchen. And so it was a remarkable coming together of talent. And that changed my life and my view of food in America. So I totally understand. So one final question. This is always a fun one because people come up with the most unusual things. What would you consider to be the most important food invention in history?
I would say the art of bread, right? Because it's, whether it's a injera, flat bread, or sourdough, or pizza bread, that idea of flour, rice, hot stone, oven, fire, whatever combination you do it in, I would say bread.
That's a great idea. And also I think that's some of your Swedish coming out as well, because I've never met a Swedish person who doesn't eat bread by the bucket load.
Yes.
And really the best bread I've ever tasted, I've had in Sweden. So that's so funny that I could see that. That's a great answer. Now, everyone knows how to get hold of you. You've got such a big profile, but if people really want to go and find you, follow you on Instagram, find out who you are, where should they be looking? What are the social media profiles we should give everyone? Because I think A, they should buy the book, and B, they should go and follow you, because I love following you on Instagram. And
go to Marcus Cooks, and I always stay updated what we do. But Simon, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for what you're doing, because the amount of knowledge that you have of food, and for us people of color, very often when we cook, we're always afraid that we cook food that the other judge or the other people don't know or see. And that's where that link between anonymous and visible, and it's so important where the journey we're on right now. I remember the first time Padma had Ethiopian food on Top Chef, it changed the trajectory of Ethiopian food. And when you are on the other side as chefs, we know that these are not strange ingredients for us. These are our ingredients, and we do not have to dumb them down. We can continue to talk about them. And that's what you're doing is so important, because if you don't know about it, you find out about it, and then you can contextualize it and present it. So it's such an important job, because it's almost like playing an instrument that people don't know how beautiful it is without understanding the context.
Well, thank you. It has been such a pleasure. This has been one of the most fantastic interviews we've done on Eat My Globe. People are going to love it. I hope they'll go out again and buy the book. And I just want to thank you for your time. I know how precious it is to you. And I hope we get to connect again soon, maybe not behind masks.
Okay, got you. Thank you so much, Simon.
Do make sure to check out the website associated with this podcast at www.eatmyglobe.com, where we will be posting the transcripts from each episode, along with all the references and resources we used putting the episodes together, in case you want to delve deeper into each subject. There is also a contact button, so please do let us know if there are any subjects that you would like us to cover. And if you like what you hear, please don't forget to subscribe, recommend us to your family and friends, and give us a good rating on your favourite podcast provider. That really makes a difference. Thank you, and goodbye from me, Simon Majumdar, and we'll speak to you soon on the next episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast about things you didn't know about food. The Eat My Globe podcast is a production of It's Not Much But It's Ours and Producergirl Productions, and is created with the kind cooperation of the UCLA Department of History. We would especially like to thank Professor Carla Pastana, the Department Chair of the Department of History, and Dr. Tawny Paul, Public History Initiative Director, for their notes on this episode. Also, a huge thank you to Sybil Villanueva for her help with the research and the preparations of the transcripts for this episode, which can be found on the website.